The flames were already swallowing the second floor when I heard her scream my name from somewhere behind the shattered windows. I had never met her before that morning. She did not even know who I was. But through the roar of the fire, the cracking wood, and the terrified voices gathering in the street, her cry somehow found me like a hand reaching through the smoke. Everyone else was running away from the burning house. I ran toward it. And when I finally carried her out beneath a sky filled with black smoke, her arms tightened around my neck as though letting go would send her back into the fire. I thought saving her life would be the hardest thing I would ever do. I was wrong. The hardest part came later, when her father looked me in the eyes and told me never to come near his daughter again. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Lifeline Vibes if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose to help when everyone else is afraid. My name is Nolan Mercer, and at the time, I was 31 years old and working as a maintenance supervisor at a small apartment complex on the edge of Briar Glen. It was not the life I had imagined for myself when I was younger. I had once trained to become a firefighter, but 3 years earlier, my younger brother, Everett, had died in a warehouse fire while working a night shift. After that, the smell of smoke could turn my knees weak. I left the academy, stopped answering calls from my friends, and built a smaller life where danger came in the form of broken water heaters and leaking roofs. I told myself I preferred it that way. The truth was that I had become afraid of anything I could not control, and fire had taught me that control was often an illusion. The morning I met Sienna Vale began with sunlight pouring through the trees and children riding bicycles along Maple Row. I had been sent to repair a damaged fence behind one of the rental homes when I noticed a thin column of smoke rising above the neighboring estate. At first, I assumed someone was burning leaves. Then I heard glass explode. A second later, orange flames pushed through an upstairs window, and a woman across the street began screaming that someone was still inside. I dropped my tools and ran before I had time to remember that I was supposed to be afraid. The front door was locked, so I broke a side window with a stone and climbed through. Heat struck me like an open furnace. Smoke rolled along the ceiling in thick, dark waves. I pulled my shirt over my mouth and crawled beneath it, calling out while the fire moved through the curtains and climbed the walls. I found Sienna near the upstairs landing, trapped beneath part of a fallen wooden beam. She was conscious but barely able to breathe. Her hair was streaked with ash, and there was blood above her eyebrow. She stared at me with wide gray eyes and tried to tell me to leave because the staircase was collapsing. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone surrounded by flames was worried about saving a stranger. I lifted the beam enough for her to drag herself free, then pulled her against me and carried her toward the stairs. The railing gave way as we reached it, forcing me to take a narrow servant staircase at the back of the house. By then, flames had reached the hallway, and the ceiling groaned above us. Sienna's fingers dug into my shoulder. She kept whispering that she could not breathe. I told her to listen to my voice, though I was not sure she could hear me over the fire. I told her we were almost outside, even when I did not know whether there was still a way out. We reached the kitchen just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind us. The back door would not open because the frame had swollen from the heat. I kicked it once, twice, then threw my body against it with everything I had left. The door burst outward, and we fell into the bright morning air. People rushed toward us. Someone pulled Sienna from my arms, but she screamed and reached back for me. Even as paramedics placed an oxygen mask over her face, she refused to release my hand. Her grip remained around my fingers while they checked her pulse, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and lifted her onto the stretcher. I walked beside the ambulance until a paramedic forced me to stop because my palms were burned and I had a deep cut along my arm. That was when her father arrived. Gideon Vale stepped out of a black car before it had fully stopped. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place among the smoke and flashing emergency lights. He ran toward Sienna, shouting her name, and for one brief moment, I saw nothing but terror on his face. Then he noticed her holding my hand. His expression changed. It was not gratitude. It was suspicion. At the hospital, doctors treated Sienna for smoke inhalation, a sprained ankle, and several minor burns. I sat in a corridor with bandages around my hands, waiting only because she had asked one of the nurses not to let me leave. Gideon stood near the window making phone calls and demanding answers about how the fire had started. He learned my name from a police officer, and within minutes, he knew where I worked, where I lived, and that I had once left firefighter training. Wealthy men like Gideon did not ask ordinary questions. They investigated. When Sienna was finally allowed visitors, she asked to see me first. Gideon objected, but she insisted. She thanked me with tears in her eyes and told me she remembered my voice guiding her through the smoke. I tried to make light of it, saying anyone would have done the same, but we both knew that was not true. Dozens of people had stood outside the house. I was the only one who went inside. When I left her room, Gideon followed me into the hallway. He did not raise his voice. That somehow made his words colder. He told me his daughter was vulnerable and confused after a traumatic event. He said gratitude could easily be mistaken for attachment. Then he offered to cover my medical bills and compensate me for missed work, as though my decision to enter the house had been a service with a price. When I refused the money, his eyes narrowed. He told me to stay away from Sienna. I should have been offended. Instead, part of me understood him. He had nearly lost his daughter. Fear often wore the mask of anger. I told him I had no intention of interfering in her life, and I meant it. I returned to my apartment that afternoon believing the story had ended. I had saved someone. She was safe. I could go back to repairing fences and pretending I had never wanted a braver life. The next morning, Sienna called me. I did not know how she had found my number. She sounded tired, but there was warmth in her voice. She said she needed to hear the voice that had brought her out of the fire. We spoke for less than 5 minutes. The day after that, she called again. Then she sent a message asking whether the burns on my hands were healing. I answered politely and kept my distance, but something about her honesty unsettled me. She did not behave like the sheltered daughter of a wealthy businessman. She was 28, worked as a children's book illustrator, and spent most of her time teaching free art classes at a community center. The house that burned had belonged to her late grandmother. Sienna had been inside sorting through old photographs when an electrical fault ignited behind a wall. A week later, she appeared at the apartment complex where I worked. It was late morning, and sunlight flashed across the windows as she crossed the courtyard with a cane beneath one arm and a paper bag in the other. She wore a pale blue dress, and the healing mark above her eyebrow was still visible. She handed me the bag and said she had brought lunch because she suspected I was the sort of man who forgot to eat while working. Inside were 2 sandwiches, fruit, and a handwritten note that simply said thank you for choosing not to be afraid. Those words stayed with me. I asked whether her father knew she was there. Her smile faded. She said Gideon knew she was grateful to me, but he did not understand why she needed to see me. I told her perhaps I did not understand either. She looked at my bandaged hands and said that when the ceiling collapsed, she had believed she was going to die. Then I appeared through the smoke, not like a hero from a story, but like a frightened man who came anyway. She said that mattered more. We began meeting in public places during the day. A cafe near the river. A bench outside the community center. A quiet bookstore with sunlight spilling through tall windows. I told myself we were only 2 people connected by a terrible morning, trying to understand what had happened. But the connection grew beyond gratitude. Sienna laughed easily, though sadness often lingered behind it. She told me her mother had died when she was 12 and that Gideon had responded by trying to protect Sienna from every possible danger. He chose her schools, screened her friends, questioned her relationships, and treated independence like a threat. I told her about Everett. It was the first time in years that I spoke my brother's name without immediately changing the subject. I told her how I had ignored his final call because I was angry with him over something small. He died before I could apologize. Since then, I had avoided fires, hospitals, and anything that reminded me how quickly people could disappear. Sienna listened without offering empty comfort. She only placed her hand over mine and said perhaps I had not run into her burning house because I had stopped being afraid. Perhaps I had run inside because I was tired of fear deciding who I was. For the first time, I considered that she might be right. Gideon learned about our meetings through one of his drivers. He confronted Sienna, and their argument was so severe that she stopped speaking to him for several days. Then he came to my workplace. The courtyard was filled with tenants and children, but he spoke quietly, maintaining the polished calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He accused me of taking advantage of his daughter's trauma. He said Sienna had confused rescue with love. When I told him I had never asked her for anything, he replied that men like me did not need to ask directly. His words cut deeper than I expected. Not because I believed him, but because a small part of me had begun to fear the same thing. What if Sienna's feelings were only the result of that burning house? What if every time she looked at me, she saw not Nolan, but the man who carried her through the flames? That evening, I told Sienna we should stop seeing each other. We sat beneath a large oak tree near the river, surrounded by families enjoying the warm afternoon. She did not cry or argue at first. She only asked whether I wanted to leave or whether I was allowing her father to make the decision for me. I said I did not want to become another source of conflict in her life. She answered that walking away without letting her choose was not kindness. It was another form of control. I had no reply. She stood carefully, leaning on her cane, and said she would not chase someone who had already decided she was incapable of knowing her own heart. Then she walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd, feeling as though I had abandoned her inside another fire. For nearly a month, we did not speak. I returned to work, but everything felt colorless. I began attending counseling for the grief I had avoided since Everett's death. I also contacted my old firefighter instructor and asked whether it was too late to return to training. He told me courage was not a door that closed after one failure. By early autumn, I had begun volunteering with Briar Glen's fire prevention program, visiting schools and community centers to teach safety procedures. That was how I saw Sienna again. She was standing in the art room at the community center while children painted pictures of firefighters beneath a bright afternoon sun. When she noticed me in uniform, she froze. I expected anger, but her eyes filled with something gentler. She walked toward me without her cane, though her steps were still cautious. I apologized before she could speak. I told her I had mistaken distance for protection because I was still afraid. I admitted that I had allowed Gideon's doubts to become my own. Sienna said she had never needed me to rescue her twice. She only needed me to trust that she could choose who remained in her life. We began again, slowly. No secrets. No dramatic promises. We shared ordinary afternoons, helped at the community center, and learned who we were beyond the day of the fire. She saw me at my worst when nightmares woke me before sunrise. I saw her struggle with panic whenever she smelled burning wood. We did not heal each other like characters in a perfect story. We simply stayed present while the other learned to heal. Gideon refused to accept our relationship. For months, he kept his distance from Sienna and blamed me for their separation. Then, one spring afternoon, a small fire broke out in the kitchen of the community center during an art class. The alarms activated immediately, and everyone evacuated safely because of the safety drills we had practiced. Gideon arrived after receiving a frantic call from one of his employees. He found Sienna outside, calmly comforting frightened children while I checked the building with the fire department. He watched us for a long time. Later, he asked to speak with me alone. His shoulders seemed less rigid than before. He admitted that after his wife died, he had confused protecting Sienna with possessing every decision around her. He said the house fire had reopened the terror of losing someone he loved, and I had become an easy target for that fear. He did not apologize elegantly. Men like Gideon were rarely practiced at surrendering pride. But he apologized honestly. I told him I understood fear better than he realized. Our relationship did not transform overnight, but the wall between us began to crack. Gideon attended one of Sienna's exhibitions. He shook my hand afterward. Months later, when I completed my firefighter certification, he stood beside Sienna during the ceremony. His applause was quiet, but it was their point. 2 years after the fire, Sienna and I returned to the land where her grandmother's house had once stood. The ruins had been cleared, and wildflowers covered the edge of the property. The sky was clear, the afternoon warm, and the only smoke came from distant chimneys. I asked her to marry me beneath the old oak tree that had survived the flames. She said yes before I finished the question. Gideon walked her down the aisle the following summer. Just before placing her hand in mine, he leaned close and said that the day I entered the fire, I saved his daughter's life. But by refusing to stay broken afterward, I had also helped save something in him. Then he stepped back and let her go, not because he loved her less, but because he had finally learned that love was not measured by how tightly we held someone. Sometimes it was measured by whether we trusted them enough to choose their own path. Sienna still wakes from nightmares occasionally. So do I. On difficult mornings, we sit together by the window and wait for the sunlight to fill the room. We do not pretend the fire never happened. The scars on my palms and the faint mark near her eyebrow remind us that it did. But scars are not only evidence of pain. They are proof that the body closed what was once an open wound. That I once believed bravery meant entering a burning building without fear. Now I know bravery can look quieter. It can mean returning to a dream after grief has convinced you to abandon it. It can mean apologizing when pride feels safer. It can mean trusting someone to love you for who you are, not only for what you did on the worst day of their life. And sometimes, bravery is simply refusing to let go of a person who has spent years believing they must face every fire alone. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Lifeline Vibes. Your support helps more stories about hope, courage, healing, and second chances reach people who may need them. Special request: comment courage chooses love. If you believe the strongest hearts are not the ones without scars, but the ones that still remain open after surviving the flames. The day I saved Sienna, I carried her out of a burning house. But in the years that followed, she led me out of a different kind of fire, the one I had kept alive inside myself through guilt, fear, and regret. Her father once told me to stay away. Sienna refused to let me disappear. And because she held on, 3 wounded people slowly became a family, not untouched by loss, but no longer ruled by it. Some fires destroy everything they touch, others reveal what was strong enough to survive.